Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a special edition of Spooky Story Tuesdays. Tonight is going to be the virtual launch party for this house, The True Story of a Girl and a Ghost, the 10th anniversary edition. So hopefully people will start to join in soon, and I will get all my little notes ready. All right. Hello, Colleen. I'm just waiting like another minute for a few more people to come in. Hernandez. Yay! All right. I'm just going to wait 30 more seconds to see if other people join so I can give the lowdown on this evening. All right. I think I waited long enough. Okay, so this is, of course, the virtual launch party for the 10th anniversary edition of this house, The True Story of a Girl and a Ghost. We've got lots of stories on deck. Looking forward to sharing everything with you. And I don't have a special guest tonight, except Mr. Oscar here is going to just probably be making intermittent appearances. But I'm going to have my hands full with with a lot of books actually to share with you. So first things first, I'm going to share some different versions of the book with you. I have not yet received in the mail the latest edition, but I do have the first three. So we'll visit memory lane, and then we will also read an excerpt from the book, of course. Then I have some other haunted house stories to share with you. Another one for more scary stories to tell in the dark. Two, actually. And yeah, if Sarah Smale was worried she was going to be scared, this is probably gonna do her in, because these two are going to be pretty scary, even though they are for kiddos. We're going to just do some brief stories from Michael Klein's book, Haunting Illinois. So we're just going to talk about some of my favorite haunted houses in Illinois. And then we're also going to talk about the Hull House, my all-time favorite haunted house here in Chicago, from Chicago Haunts, Ursula Bielski's book. And then I will end by reading another one, or I think perhaps two of my stories from Maryland Ghosts, two haunted house stories, one that happened to me and one that happened to my parents when I was a wee little baby. I'm also going to show you some objects from the house as well. But first, one more housekeeping thing. I just wanted to share with you what I'm currently reading. I finished the Gumbo Yaya book, which was really cool. That was the Louisiana Folktales book, which I have right here. Oof. Highly recommend. It was hard to get through. The language is very dated, but it was a lot of fun. And right now I'm tearing through this book, and I'm probably going to finish it today or tomorrow. Dead Mountain, the untold true story of the Dyatlov Pass incident. So if you are interested in unsolved mysteries, true crime, conspiracy theories, any of those, this falls under that category. This is like the JFK assassination level mystery to Russia, and it involves 9 hikers who disappeared in the Russian wilderness in 1959. Highly recommend this book and the study of the case as well. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Hi everybody, thank you for everybody who joined. This is the virtual launch party for the 10th anniversary edition of this house. You can read the description. I just want you to know that if you leave a comment, so I see that a lot of people have joined, if you're interested in being entered to win a signed copy of the book, just leave a comment. We are literally going to put everybody's name on a little piece of paper, and Jonathan's going to draw them out of a hat after this. Over on Twitter, if you retweet my pinned tweet, I will also enter you. So you can't win 2 copies, but you can win 1. All right. So undoubtedly, since the book is already 10 years old, some of you have read it already. And the latest edition does have a few little fun additions to it, but mostly it's the same classic story. This is the very first edition of the book. It's like teeny tiny, like pocket version. Still very close to my heart, still very adorable. This was self-published in 2010 using Lulu, in case anybody's interested in doing their own self-publishing. It became popular, I think, because I chose like interesting key search words for the title of the book. I just thought I could come up with like a cool, snazzy title. And it turns out that like when people were searching for ghost stories and true stories and all that kind of stuff, like my book ended up coming up in their searches. And so unbeknownst to me at the time, I had some, market savvy, and the book ended up getting picked up by Black Oak Media in 2011. So this was I don't know why I can't get this right, the second edition. Also very pretty, an old photo of me. Whew. My, how things change. And then in 2014, the third edition came along from Breaking Fate Publishing, and this one's a really gorgeous edition. Still has kind of an old picture of me there. And and then the fourth edition, I've shared the photo and everything on Facebook, but I don't have the copies yet. They're on their way in the mail, so I'm really excited, and I'll just share that, obviously. I'll post a photo of it, or I'll share it out in a future Spooky Story Tuesdays. So I also, since this is based on a true story, it's based on events that happened when I was a kid growing up in Maryland. There are objects mentioned in the house that I had taken, and those are real. So, for instance, there's a very important scene where I take a jar. Now, normally, I don't recommend taking things from abandoned houses or historic places. Obviously, that's just a disclaimer. But this was a house that I had explored and that I had loved, and they were actually about to tear the house down. And I had this compelling feeling that I should take something to remember the house by. I was also 11 years old, so, give me a break on that. But I've held on to this for 24 years, and I love this little jar, and I like to think of it as a haunted object, because I do still feel like the presence of Walter is around once in a while in a positive way. So maybe that's my little haunted jar. I had also taken a newspaper from the house, and this is the newspaper. I understand that a Ziploc bag is probably not the most, it's not the best way to preserve it. But actually it also might be, because I had this in like an archival sleeve at some point too, and it was not, it deteriorated during that time, and then it stopped when I put it in the Ziploc bag. So it doesn't look very fancy, but it's like my little evidence bag. And then in the back, you can see there's another little magazine also. What's interesting is that this newspaper comes from, this is from Friday the 13th, 1946. And the most recent objects that I had found in the house when I was exploring it were from the 1950s. So the house had been abandoned since the 1950s, and even though people had gone through it and there was graffiti and there were, it had been trashed, a lot of the objects were still there. I distinctly remember a can of carnation milk still sitting out on the kitchen table. Maybe somebody had put it there over the years, but it weathered many storms. Over the years, I have also shared my journal entries with people. So these are featured at the end of the book. Oh, this lighting. There we go. Whoa. There we go. And you can see that they were written in 1997. These are featured at the end of the book. They taught, these were my true experiences. I used to document my ghost hunting adventures. And I also loved to write when I was a kid, which makes sense because I grew up and became a writer. So I actually have these if you're ever interested in seeing them. And I take these to events and things too to show people that the story is true. It really happened. And then finally, I just have some photos taken on an actual, like an old-fashioned camera where I had to get the film, developed at a Rite Aid. And you can see that this is the, there we go, photo from the cover of the book. And then that's me. That's 11 or 12-year-old Amelia next to my friend Graham. You can see that I was very tall for my age when I was in 6th grade. I think I was about as tall as I am now. And yeah, some other cool pictures as well. And then in the attic, that's where I saw Walter standing and leaning out of the windows. But as you can see, you would have to lie down to lean out the windows. But the figure that I saw was standing up and leaning out of the windows with his arms on the windowsill. Mm-hmm. And that's how I knew that he couldn't be a living person. So I do hope if you haven't gotten the book yet that obviously you're going to get the book. But it is a... Yay, big up to Bel Air, Wendy. It is a story that's very close to my heart. Obviously, I wrote a book about it that launched a writing career, but I never really expected that. When I wrote it, I just wanted to share this this endearing, kind of heartwarming story, this little paranormal romance, and share that story with the world. And so here I am 10 years later. So it's pretty cool. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the book. That's how we're going to start this evening, and then we'll move on to some other favorite haunted house stories of mine. I have water this time so that my voice doesn't go wacky like it did last time. All right. Let me make sure I mentioned all the things I wanted to mention. All righty. I think so. Okay, let's go. On a still and warm night in September, I threw my backpack in the back seat, Mom put our flashlight in the cup holder, and we drove out late to pick Dad up from work. On the way, I felt nervous and elated, daydreaming while watching the moon and the dark silhouettes of trees go by. The drive consisted almost entirely of fields and wooded areas, some abandoned barns, and a graveyard. The tone was set. As we turned onto the road the restaurant was on, Mom told me to look out my window to the right and through the trees to see the house. Sure enough, as we slowed down to get a good look at it, I glimpsed over the guardrail and through a row of evergreens to the black expanse of a large old house. I could feel my heart thudding in my ears. It was like a giant monster sitting behind a cage at some sideshow, watching us, watching it. I had a feeling of horror and elation all at once. We passed it slowly and soon pulled into the parking lot of the restaurant. We curved around and drove back to the farthest edge of the parking lot where no one else was parked. Our headlights stared straight into the back and the side of Walter's house. It stood slightly apart from the restaurant and its companion house. We couldn't even see the other, more dilapidated house at the road's edge. Where there was light and noise and laughter coming from the terrace behind us, there was a sudden and overpowering darkness and seclusion in the house's direction. The house was completely alone. As I got out of the car and fumbled for the flashlight, I realized how nervous I was and how frightening and ridiculous the thought of actually entering an abandoned house at midnight might be. It was someone's house after all, and once upon a time, it had been occupied by people's lives and feelings and energies. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. It was as if the house was watching us and knew we wanted to come in, like there were a bunch of people gathered at the windows waiting nervously for us to try and break in. I suddenly didn't want to go in there. "There's old Walter's house," Mom said casually and slammed the car door. I shuddered. I didn't want anyone to hear us. "Let's go, Nora," she said. I walked up alongside her, turned on the flashlight, and we started towards the house. "I have an uneasy feeling," I admitted quietly. "That's 'cause this place is creepy as hell," she responded, holding my wrist for comfort. "That must be it," I agreed, laughing uncomfortably. We approached cautiously. The unfortunate thing about flashlights is that they light up everything in front of you very nicely, but make what's to the sides of you and at your feet pitch black. You'd think I would have noticed that sometime in my life before this. As we turned the corner of the porch and came to stand in front of the house, I looked into the old broken windows and was filled with fear. I wasn't scared of any living people, but something else, and I could feel that something all around us. I could smell the old sour odor of rotting wood and water damage. It also dawned on me that this could be very dangerous. Would it not have been wiser to first explore the place in the daytime? We didn't even know if the floors were stable in all places. I looked all around me. The porch spanned the front of the house and was caving slightly in the middle. There was a second floor with a row of broken windows. Up on the side of the house were 2 tiny black attic windows, typical of historic houses in Maryland. Those windows were like 2 black eyes peering down at us. I couldn't decide if it was the house or someone or something in it that was watching us. The front screen door was hanging on its hinges in the moonlight, but the front door itself stood wide open. Even with my own mother there, I felt alone and terrified. All of my friends were probably at home, sleeping on the phone or watching TV, and I was standing in front of an empty 200-year-old house with a flashlight and a backpack. I don't think I started. "I'll go in first," Mom said, taking the flashlight and hopping up onto the porch. She tripped a little. "Careful, follow closely behind me." "Thanks for the tip," I said, and fumbled and tripped and pulled myself up onto the deceptively high porch. "Shine the light on me, I whined nervously as the light went all over the doorframe and into the house. I stood right up close behind Mom and held my breath. As we entered, I felt an immediate sensation of being unwelcome. The musty stench I had smelled before became overwhelming. We did not belong there. "God, I feel like someone doesn't want us here," Mom whispered. "Really?" I asked, feeling my eyebrows clenched together. I was just thinking that. We stepped over the threshold and were immediately greeted by a cluttered staircase going up to the second floor. "The floor seems sturdy," Mom said. "Dad said people come in here all the time, so we should be fine. Just watch your step. Feel first before you walk." I didn't answer, just nodded. To the left and right were large rooms with clutter and trash and some tables and chairs that looked like the foldable lawn type. I could see a fireplace in each room, which must have been very cozy at one time. No bookshelves yet, and I couldn't make out what was in the back of the house. Everything on the periphery of the flashlight's beam was disturbingly black. We looked from left to right and decided to go to the right, inching through what was presumably the living room. I gripped the back of my mother's shirt with my fist. The light from the flashlight shined onto an old-fashioned kitchen stove and sink at the very back of the house in what seemed to be a more recent addition. There was even a 1950s-style sun porch at the far left. There was stuff all over the floor in there, and it was clearly too cluttered to enter. It amazed me how long this place must have stood abandoned. I looked down at my feet and saw that I was stepping on all kinds of old newspapers and magazines. I had just started to take an interest in the place when I looked to my left and saw a gaping black hole in the wall. A doorway. "Hey, what's this for?" I asked, and took a step towards it. Mom shone the flashlight on it, but it was too late for me to step back. I found myself reading the words, "Stairway to Hell," in green spray paint with an arrow pointing down and to the right. My eyes followed the direction of the arrow, and I found myself staring at the dirt floor of the basement below. My feet were inches from the non-existent staircase. Out of surprise and the feeling of being watched from down there, I jumped back and shouted. The shouting must have spooked my mother because all of a sudden she started shrieking along with me. There was a moment of almost amusing panic where we both stood still, taking turns shouting, and then we suddenly scrambled for the doorway to get out of the house. Mom leapt ahead with the flashlight and turned back to light my way. We jumped off the porch and ran back around the side of the house where we had come from. I was running for my life, like I could feel something was coming after us and was just going to get me for sure. We headed for the car, and as I looked back, I swear I thought I saw feet coming through the grass after us. Well, the time from the stairway to hell to the safety of our car must have been all of 5 to 7 seconds. The parking lot was safe territory again, and the dim light that emanated from the restaurant felt like base in the game of tag. I looked back at the house. It was just sitting there, still, dignified. It was definitely haunted. At a loss, we both just started to laugh. "Did I scare you?" I asked, out of breath. Mom was pale and shaking. "No," she said. "I thought I heard a noise when you were looking down the staircase, and then you screamed, and I assumed you were screaming about what I heard. And so with seeing those words on the wall and the noise, everything happened so fast. I don't know what to think." A noise, I wondered. What kind of noise? Just a creaking. I looked back at the house again. It was so mysterious. I was terrified, but already wanted to go back again. "Maybe we can visit again, in the daytime sometime?" I asked. "Yeah, let's do that. You're not too scared now, are you?" she laughed. "No, I think we might have scared ourselves." We got into the car. She turned it on and we drove around to where we normally picked up Dad. He was waiting there for us. He opened the door and stuck his head in the car. "Hey, kids, did you guys go into Walter's house?" he asked dramatically. So that is the little snippet from This House, The True Story of a Girl and a Ghost. The edition that I'm holding in my hands is the teeny tiny first edition from 2010. The brand new one that has just been released has not arrived yet, so I don't have it. I am excited to share it with you once I do have it in my hands. But if you are just joining us and you leave a comment, you will be entered to win a copy of the book. We are literally going to shuffle all of your names in a hat after this is over, and then pick one person from Facebook and one person who retweets my pinned tweet on Twitter, and I'll announce the winners tomorrow morning. So, does anybody have any questions about the book or about Walter or this house or anything before we move on to just regular other haunted house stories? I'll give you a moment. Uh-oh, I put these all out of order. All right. If you do, just leave a comment while we move along. All right. So I have 2 quick stories to share with you from More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I think this is my favorite of the 3. These are haunted house related. One of them is kind of quarantine related. So that might be a little dark, but I chose it for the occasion. The first one that we're going to read is called Sounds. The house was near the beach. It was a big old place where nobody had lived for years. From time to time, somebody would force open a window or a door and spend the night there, but never longer. 3 fishermen caught in a storm took shelter there one night. With some dry wood they found inside, they made a fire in the fireplace. They lay down on the floor and tried to get some sleep, but none of them slept that night. First, they heard footsteps upstairs. It sounded like there were several people moving back and forth. When one of the fishermen called, "Who's up there?" the footsteps stopped. Then they heard a woman scream. The scream turned into a groan and died away. Blood began to drip from the ceiling into the room where the fishermen huddled. A small red pool formed on the floor and soaked into the wood. A door upstairs crashed shut, and again the woman screamed. "Not me!" she cried. It sounded as if she was running, her high heels tapping wildly down the hall. "I'll get you," a man shouted, and the floor shook as he chased her. Then silence. There wasn't a sound until the man who had shouted began to laugh. Long peals of horrible laughter filled the house. It went on and on until the fishermen thought they would go mad. When it finally stopped, the fishermen heard someone coming down the stairs dragging something heavy that bumped on each step. They heard him drag it through the front hall and out the front door. The door opened, then it slammed shut. Again, silence. Suddenly, a flash of lightning filled the house with a green blaze of light. A ghastly face stared at the fishermen from the hallway. Then came a crash of thunder. Terrified, they ran out into the storm. Whoa. And that is the illustration for that. All right. The other one, and this is the illustration for that one, is called The Bed by the Window. I felt this was appropriate for any of us who've been kind of feeling a little stir crazy. Or inappropriate, depending on how you look at it, I guess. The 3 old men shared a room at the nursing home. Their room had only one window, but for them it was the only link to the real world. Ted Conklin, who had been there the longest, had the bed next to the window. When Ted died, the man in the next bed, George Best, took his place, and the third man, Richard Green, took George's bed. Despite his illness, George was a cheerful man who spent his days describing the sights he could see from his bed. Pretty girls, a policeman on horseback, a traffic jam, a pizza parlor, a fire station, and other scenes of life outside. Richard loved to listen to George, but the more George talked about life outside, the more Richard wanted to see it for himself. Yet he knew that only when George died would he have his chance. He wanted to look out that window so badly that one day he decided to kill George. He's going to die soon anyway, he told himself. What difference does it make? George had a bad heart. If he had an attack during the night and a nurse could not get to him right away, he had pills he could take. He kept them in a bottle on top of the cabinet between his bed and Richard's. All Richard had to do was knock the bottle to the floor where George could not reach it. A few nights later, George died, just as Richard had planned he would, and the next morning Richard was moved to the bed by the window. Now he would finally see for himself all the things outside that George had described. After the nurses left, Richard turned to the window and looked out, but all he could see was a blank brick wall. Cheerful. Sarah asked a question in the comments. It is, how long did it take you to write it, This House, The True Story of a Girl and a Ghost? I started writing that story in college. It was originally a short story. It was just supposed to be me recounting the experience based on a conversation I had working at the Pry House, which is on the Antietam battlefield, with coworkers, and that was a haunted house as well. We used to sit there and swap ghost stories, and I started thinking, like, wow, I really should write this down. And then after college, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I spent 6 months in treatment, and I moved home with my parents for that. And it was actually during that time that I sat down and really fleshed the book out. And it turned into a novella, and I continued to flesh it out until it became something that was book length. And I decided when I moved to Chicago, which was after my treatment, after I got better, that I was going to try and publish that as my first book. And I ended up obviously self-publishing it to begin with. I said, this will be fun. I'll go on this journey and we'll see where it leads. So it did actually, it took me a long time to really write the book. And I guess I started writing it when I was 21 or 22. All right. So next we're going to do a little stop off in Chicago. And I have Michael Klein's book here, Haunting Illinois, the 3rd edition. And it just has little snippets of info about different places in Illinois to go visit that are purportedly haunted. And so I'm just going to share these little brief descriptions that he has of three of my favorite haunted places in Illinois. The first one is the Tinker Swiss Cottage. I love the Tinker Swiss Cottage. I love the people at the Tinker Swiss Cottage, and it's a beautiful, beautiful house out in Rockford. It's close by if you can get there. They also sell my book in the gift shop, which I'm really proud of. And I'll just read you this little snippet. Built in 1865 on a bluff just south of downtown Rockford, the Tinker Swiss Cottage took its name from its unique architecture, which was inspired by Robert Hall Tinker's visit to Europe in 1862. The Tinker family lived at the home until around 1940, when Mrs. Tinker willed it to the Rockford Park District and it became a museum. In recent years, several paranormal teams investigated the cottage after visitors repeatedly asked the museum curators if it was haunted. During one investigation, a woman's voice appeared on an audio recorder saying, "I don't like trains. Trains bring death," as a train passed by on the railroad tracks outside. At other times, doors closed with no apparent explanation. And of course, Robert Tinker was also struck by a train. So here's a little photo. Whoop. There we go. Can you see that? Too close? There we go. On the Tinker Swiss Cottage. I hosted a documentary about the Tinker Swiss Cottage that you can find, that Michael Klein produced. You can find that on Amazon. It's just a great, great house. And a very warm, if it's, it has a very warm feeling to it of being haunted by people who really loved living there and really loved each other and wanted to continue to be together in their afterlife. The other house that I wanted to share is the John Wayne Gacy house. So some people think, and I think that's rightly so, that it's too soon to start talking about Gacy and hauntings and things like that. A lot of the victims are family and friends they're still alive, they're still around. I think last year I took a trip up to Norwood Park with some friends, and we actually saw the site of the house, which is a new house that looks different than all the other houses on the street, and it has a different number, and it was very eerie just to pass by it. I think that house is for sale now, or it was recently for sale, And in any case, I will read about this for you. John Wayne Gacy is a notorious name among Chicagoans. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy raped and murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men. He hid most of the bodies in the crawl space under his home, and the rest he buried around his property or dumped into the Des Plaines River. His crimes, which shocked the nation, were made all the more horrible because of Gacy's charity performances as Pogo the Clown, which won him the nickname the Killer Clown. He was convicted of 33 murders on March 13, 1980, and executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Meanwhile, a strange phenomenon was reported at his former home. The house had been demolished in 1979, but the area where the bodies were discovered remained barren years after they were exhumed. The quicklime Gacy spread to mask the smell of decay was ruled out as a culprit, since police had extensively turned up the soil in their search for evidence. It was as though the vegetation itself was repelled by the horror of what happened. Eventually, the lot was sold, and a new home built at that location. Since that time, everything appears to have returned to normal. And then, one more haunted house that I wanted to share with you from outside of Chicago down towards the southern Illinois area close to St. Louis in Alton is the McPike Mansion. And actually, I don't think there was not a photo that went with the Gacy house, no. But you can Google it. Here's the McPike Mansion. Whoop. Built in 1869 by Henry Guest McPike and designed in the Italianate Victorian style, this mansion has long captured the imaginations of Alton residents. Although it was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1980, it has sat abandoned for decades, attracting vandals and the curious alike. Ghost stories were told about the mansion even when it was occupied. In the 1940s, boarders often heard children running up and down the stairs, but could find no one when they investigated the noise. After the mansion became derelict, passers-by reported seeing faces in the windows. There are two known entities here. The mansion's new owners named one of them Sarah. She is thought to have been a hired hand in life and teases visitors with a spectral touch or hug. The other ghost belongs to a former owner, Paul Leikinger. He has been spotted wandering the grounds. So there you go, Sarah. That gives you a goal for when you want to become a ghost one day, maybe. Sneaking up and hugging people. Not something I would do in life either. All right. So I'm going to share a longer haunted house story from the Chicago, Illinois area. And that, of course, is the Hull House, one of my favorite haunted places. You can visit the Hull House during the day. It's a museum. It's an operating museum. So, if you go, please go with an air of respect. But it is the site of one of the most famous hauntings, or I guess legends, and that is of the Devil Baby. So I'm going to read from Chicago Haunts by Ursula Bielski about dealing with the devil at Hull House. Okay. As a champion of women's independence and the founder of one of progressivism's most controversial institutions, much was asked of Jane Addams, most of which she was able to provide: shelter to the homeless, food to the hungry, encouragement to the hopeless, protection from abusive injustice. But there came a brief period in the life of her pioneering settlement house, Hull House, when the needs of its visitors became insatiable, when women began arriving there by the handful demanding to see the Devil Baby. From the beginning, Addams was incensed by a rumor circulating throughout the turn-of-the-century city that Hull House was sheltering a horned and hoofed newborn with the blood of Satan in its veins. After a first group of women pushed through the front door demanding a look at the child, the parade of curious appeared unstoppable. Each day for 6 weeks, women of every class and culture streamed into the settlement house, hoping to return home with a tale of the alleged incarnation. Each day, Addams turned them away with growing annoyance at what she saw as a pathetic oppression of immigrant women by their old-world superstitions, and the contagion of emotion added to that aesthetic sociability which impels any one of us to drag the entire household to the window when a procession comes into the street or a rainbow appears in the sky. That is a Jane Addams quote. Bewildered by the story's hold on the public imagination, yet unable to persuade the curious of the tale's falsehood, Adams resorted to private interviews with each of the older visitors. In the course of these sessions, she discovered a common quality of desperation among them. Listening with interest to their versions of the stories and the circumstances of their own lives, Adams became aware that the tale was serving a serious need, that of exhausted, ignored, and forgotten women to be heard. By hastening to Hull House in search of this monstrous infant, they were rushing for a chance to win the respect of their husbands, children, and neighbors, to seize the spotlight for a moment before slipping back into painful obscurity. It is intriguing that for each culture represented by these women, there seemed to be a separate interpretation of the devil baby, but a moral common to them all. The father of the baby had been punished with the evil offspring for his ingratitude for the expected baby or mistreatment of his pregnant wife and her cultural traditions. There's a little photo there. One interesting side note is that when I was reading the Gumbo Yaya Louisiana Folktales book, which I already put away, there was a similar legend that occurred in New Orleans. All right. Italian women described a young Catholic girl who had foolishly married an atheist. After she hung a portrait of the Blessed Virgin on their apartment wall, her husband ripped it down, proclaiming that he'd rather have the devil in the house than such a picture. The devil baby was his punishment for that preference. A Jewish version described the sheepish mother of a handful of daughters and a heartless husband in search of a son. When his wife became pregnant again, the husband clearly announced his preference that she give birth to the devil before another girl. That bitter proclamation sealed the child's fate. Just as the causes of the catastrophe varied, so did descriptions of the resulting imp. Though most described a simple horned baby, the more animated narrators added a tail or hooves. Many told of how the child had been born blaspheming and cursing its parents with unimaginable language. In other accounts, the child was fond of smoking cigars and laughing incessantly at its poor parents. Finally, after struggling to control the damned thing, the father hopelessly took it to the heroine of Hull House, Jane Addams herself. Allegedly, Hull House workers had the baby taken to a local church for baptism, but it struggled out of the priest's grasp and began to dance along the back pews. Unable to pacify the evil infant, Addams kept it locked under supervision in an upstairs room at Hull House, where, according to most later versions of the story, it eventually died. Intriguingly, one obscure version of the devil baby story ties it to the urban legend known as the devil in the dance hall, one incident of which was alleged to have occurred in the Bridgeport neighborhood, a short distance from Hull House. Some curiosity apparently arose as to whether the dashing and diabolical stranger who appeared in the crowd at that Bridgeport dance hall may have impregnated one of the young women at the dance, perhaps a Hull House resident out for an evening of merriment, a welcome reprieve from the sadness of everyday life. Believers in this connection point out the likelihood of such a lonely and searching young woman to be charmed out of her sensibilities by the reportedly enchanting stranger of lore. Though most accounts of the devil baby story begin and end at Hull House, others have speculated that the baby was taken out of the house and sent by the humanitarian Addams to a more isolated home, perhaps even the Waukegan Retreat House, which she founded on the North Shore. Today, among believers in the existence of a so-called devil baby of Hull House, there continues a debate between those who believe that the baby was just that, an earthly manifestation of diabolical origin, and those convinced that the child was, sadly but simply, a deformed infant brought to Hull House by a destitute mother. Believers in the second likelihood also assume that the child either died at Hull House or was sent from public scrutiny to a quieter shelter outside of the city. Whether or not a baby, deformed or demonic, was ever brought to Hull House, belief in the fact has remained fierce. The widespread popularity of the Hollywood film Rosemary's Baby, inspired by the Hull House story, has proven that the appeal of the tale is hardly provincial, though local accounts persist of an evil little mug that glares out of the upstairs window, as do reports of foggy upper windows and feelings of unease. Adding to the building's mystery have been a few self-styled ghost hunters whose photos of shadowy figures on the inside staircase are sometimes used to back up rumors of a woman's suicide having taken place in an upstairs room. During her lifetime, Addams did what she could to prevent this haunting of Hull House. Soon after the phenomenon, she seized the opportunity to proselytize on the wretched state of women's lives, sharing her visitors' stories with the readership of the Atlantic Monthly in October 1916, and emphasizing her belief, and this is her quote, that the old women who came to visit the devil baby believed that the story would secure them a hearing at home, and as they prepared themselves with every detail of it, their old faces shone with a timid satisfaction. These days, as busloads of ghost hunters eyeball Hull House, hoping for a glimpse of a gruesome little face, a misty window, or a filmy form on the staircase, Jane Addams must turn often in her grave, disgusted by the enduring appeal of a foul and fantastic fairy tale. Yet even the realistic progressivist was not altogether grounded in modern convictions. During her own administration of Hull House, Addams engaged in at least one superstition of her own, placing pails of water on the attic stairs to keep the ghosts away. And that was about the Jane Addams Hull House from the Chicago Haunts book by Ursula Bielski. All right. Let's travel back to my home state of Maryland now for the last two stories that I'm going to read, which are going to come from my book, Maryland Ghosts, Paranormal Encounters in the Free State. One of them is going to be from a haunted house that I worked at in college, not the Pry House. I can share that story sometime as well, because I do have a story about the Pry House in here, but I was just in Frederick a few weeks ago, before all of this got started. Jonathan and I took a trip. We visited Hood College, where I went to school. We saw Bel Air, Maryland, where I grew up. We went to the Antietam Battlefield. We saw the Pry House, where I had worked. We saw the Schifferstadt Museum in Frederick, which is the story that I'm going to read. We did this whole nostalgia tour. We also went back and visited the site where Walter's house was. And there's a picture of it on my blog of me standing in front of the level grassy field. There's now an equine hospital. Equine's the word, right? I think so. It's a horse hospital there. It's out in Baltimore County, Maryland, where it's called Horse Country. So the restaurant, the Manor Tavern, is still there. The house that was lived in at the time that Walter's house was there is now abandoned. There's the grassy lot where Walter's house was, and then the hospital next to it. But it still holds a lot of magic where that site was. But I thought it would be fun to share this very short story about the Schifferstadt Museum in Frederick County. The Schifferstadt Architectural Museum is an historic treasure that can be found on Rosemont Avenue near the Hood College exit off of I-70. Built in 1758, it is one of the finest examples of colonial German architecture in the country, and boasts many of its original architectural features, including a large stone furnace inscribed in German with the biblical phrase, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." It is operated by the Frederick County Landmarks Foundation. Open to the public at certain times for tours and living history demonstrations, the Schifferstadt is dependent entirely on volunteer power, donations, and grants. The original stone house was built by Josef Brunner, one of many German immigrants who settled the Maryland and Pennsylvania areas. He traveled from his hometown of Schifferstadt, Germany, to establish a home in what was at the time considered frontier land and a crossroads of battle during the French and Indian War. The museum is allegedly haunted by several ghosts, including his. The house has seen numerous owners, occupants, and caretakers over the century, but the main spirits encountered are a male, a female, and a child that all seem to date from the late 18th century and early 19th centuries. The little boy spirit is mostly seen in the attic, the female spirit in the kitchen area, and the male apparition in the gift shop on the first floor. Volunteers and staff have also reported hearing disembodied voices echoing through the house. Speaking in German, of course. Footsteps, phantom doors slamming, and even hammering and construction sounds. I did an internship at the Schifferstadt during 2 semesters in college as a freshman and into my sophomore year. I had a rather interesting experience while working up in the office alone on a crisp fall day. The inside door of the gift shop that leads to the upstairs is equipped with a set of jingle bells that prevents visitors from accidentally going up to an office area where they aren't allowed. The museum was closed, and I was by myself working on the computer in the office. Sometimes other volunteers or an employee with a set of keys would stop by to drop something off or perform some other task for the museum. Without really thinking about it, I heard the door from the gift shop to the upstairs open and the bells start to jingle. I figured someone was coming up, and I just hadn't heard the main front door open. Then I heard several heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. At some point, they just stopped. I stopped typing and looked up, wondering why the person wasn't saying anything and had stopped halfway up the stairs. I had the distinct impression that there was a man there and got up from my desk to walk over and see who he was. Of course, I saw no one, and the gift shop door was still closed. I quietly returned to my desk, thoroughly weirded out, and resumed working. There were a few other occasions when I remember being alone and getting a serious case of the creeps, suddenly and out of nowhere. My solution was usually to pretend I didn't notice anything and just keep working until the odd sensation would fade away. The Schifferstadt is an otherwise friendly and inviting place, and the spirits are known to be warm and not scary. Perhaps Josef Brunner just likes to stop by every once in a while and see who is looking after his historic home. All right, and I will end our stories for the evening with a story called Mrs. Harmon's House, and this was related to me over the phone by my mom, who both of my parents moved into this Victorian-style house when I was an itty-bitty baby, and my grandmother was still alive, and I guess this would have been where it all began, you could say. All right, so this was in Westminster in Carroll County, for those who are in the Maryland area. My parents moved into their first home in Westminster when I was just a baby. Here they had several encounters with a ghost they never saw, but who made her presence very well known to them. I was too young to remember any of it, and am thankful for it now, especially after hearing my mom's stories about the house and meeting Mrs. Harmon. My parents moved into the late Victorian row home on Green Street in 1986 when I was about a year old. My grandmother, my mother's mother, moved in with us and helped care for me while my parents worked. The house, already about 90 years old at that time, had formerly been owned by one Mrs. Harmon, whose name was still etched into the original brass knocker on the front door. According to a conversation my mom had with their landlord, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Harmon had been a nice elderly lady who had lived in the house her whole life and had passed away peacefully at the hospital not long before we moved in. The house had 3 stories, an unfinished basement with a dirt floor, and a first and second story with original hardwood floors. One interesting feature of the house was that although it was small, it had multiple staircases. The main stairway connected the living room to the upstairs with a small landing halfway up. My parents' bedroom was next to the top of those stairs. There was a servant's stairwell located next to my bedroom door, which led down to the kitchen. Each end of the stairwell had a door with a small window. My parents almost never used it because even with both doors open, the passage in between was always very dark. There was still another staircase in my room. My parents chose my room for me because it had a sun porch with large windows that I could use as a playroom. The first floor next to the kitchen had an identical sunroom, and there was a staircase connecting my porch to that porch below. In the first year or so of living there, my mom says the only person who really experienced anything was my grandmother, who stayed in a bedroom with no windows in the center of the second floor. My grandmother became interested in the occult later in life and would claim to see visions of Mrs. Harmon. She would also feel someone standing over her and breathing on her as she slept at night, pitch black with the door closed and all the lights off. She was never afraid, though. My mom feels that because my grandmother was also aging and ill at that time, as well as open to the paranormal, that perhaps Mrs. Harmon might have felt a connection to her and had an urge to watch over her or be near her. Sometime around 1988, when I was 3 years old, my mom received a phone call from Mr. Reed one evening asking if she had seen her yet. When my mom asked who he meant, he replied, "Mrs. Harmon, of course." My mom asked him if that was a joke and why he hadn't said anything about a haunting when they first moved in. He assured her it was no joke, but he was apparently an eccentric old man and didn't have much more to say about it than that. My mom shared this with my dad, and needless to say, it bothered them both. She is convinced today that once they opened their minds to the possibility of the house being haunted, Mrs. Harmon was able to reveal herself to them. My mom points out that around this time I also started telling her and my dad about how I didn't feel comfortable in my room. I was apparently bothered by how many doors and windows were in there. I would tell her I could hear someone moving around in my room at night and touching my stuffed animals. After Mr. Reed's phone call, she started to take my concerns more seriously. My mom says that while she never believed Mrs. Harmon meant us any harm and was only keeping watch over all of us, she and my dad went on to have 2 frightening encounters with her that they will never forget. I'll let her tell the story as she told me. So this isn't her words. It was wintertime. Your grandmother was in the hospital having her monthly blood transfusion. Your dad and I were at home, not working, and had put you to bed and gone to bed early ourselves. It was around 10 p.m., and we were just starting to drift off to sleep. All of a sudden, Dad said, "Shh," just like that. I asked him, "Jim, what is it?" He said, "Shh." We lay there perfectly still, and it was then that I heard that first footstep at the bottom of the creaky wooden staircase. We listened to each slow, deliberate step coming up each individual stair, slowly, like how an old woman would walk. We started shaking. We were so scared. The house was locked up tight. No one could have gotten in, and we just knew instinctually at that point that it wasn't someone from the outside. As she approached the landing on the first set of stairs, we literally started pulling the blankets up over ourselves. At that point, we were frightened to death, but still thought it might go away. I asked Jim again, "What is it?" "Shh," was all he said. Then she began to ascend the second flight of stairs, slowly. Again, we could hear every footstep and the loud creaking of those stairs all the way up. Jim said, "God, Louise, I think it's her." The final step on the top floor was right next to our bedroom, right outside the door. Finally, Jim shouted, "Go away." I never knew him to be scared of ghosts or supernatural things. She never came any further. You see, we were afraid that if she had kept coming, we would actually see her, and if that had happened, we were going to have to move. The next incident occurred the following spring. It was warmer, a chilled warm, so I know it must have been springtime. My mother was away again in the hospital for an overnight stay. I was off from work and had put you to bed. It was dark out, so it must have been around 9 p.m. Jim was at work. An hour after you were put to bed, I was in the living room on the sofa, watching television and waiting for Jim to come home. The front door was open with the screen door closed to let the fresh air in. I started to hear those footsteps from the upstairs coming down the hall from your room. Remember, the whole way upstairs was not carpeted and creaked all the time. But I heard distinctive slow walking from outside your door all the way down the hall. I thought maybe you had gotten up and wanted to come down. I called out, "Amelia, are you up?" I didn't hear anything. If it had been you, you would have answered. The footsteps continued deliberately, louder and louder, as she, approached the top of the landing. From the sofa, I was right in full view of whatever it was. I started shaking again, and I got up and ran through the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen to where the back stairs were that led to your room. I opened the door to the sun porch and called up those stairs to you. You didn't answer. I went back in the living room, and I actually heard the footsteps continuing and starting to come down the stairs. I headed out the front door and sat on the front porch swing where I could look in the window through the old lace curtains and watch the staircase. I wanted to be outside just in case I needed to bolt it to the neighbors next door. But there was no one and no more footsteps. Jim came home at around 11 and found me still on the porch. I told him and was still shaking. He went upstairs and checked on you, and you were fine. He even looked in your grandmother's bedroom. Nothing was moved, nothing was out of place. It was her. I know it as I sit here. I was wide awake that night, and I know it was her. Her footsteps even sounded like she had on those big shoes that really old women wore back then, those big cushiony clog-type shoes that would insulate their feet. I couldn't have been imagining things. Now this is back to my voice. My parents moved us that summer, after our 4-year lease was up, to an apartment in Baltimore County where they could be closer to work. That's where my grandmother eventually passed away. What I find most interesting is that both times my mom or parents encountered Mrs. Harmon, my grandmother wasn't home. I drove past the house in Westminster several years ago on my way to a college function just to see my childhood home while I was in the area. The house is still there and occupied, so I didn't approach it. It had looked so gigantic to me when I was a little girl, but now just looks like a regular old-fashioned townhouse on an old-fashioned street. So there's that story about how my mom left me alone with a ghost. And then for those who are curious, we moved to Bel Air, Maryland, I think around the time that I was 11. So shortly after the incident with Walter's house happened, that is when we moved. And I refer to Bel Air as my hometown since we did spend... Hello, I'm back. We did spend most of our time there. I imagine you just got a nice glimpse of my special guest this evening, Mr. Oscar, who you can see is lounging very comfortably back there. This is it for the stories that I wanted to read. I'll share with you one more time. These are the 3 covers so far for this house. I'm still waiting to receive the 4th edition, the 10th anniversary edition. And anybody who has left a comment during this live watch party, virtual launch party, will be entered to win a book. We are literally going to put everybody's name in a hat and shuffle it up and pick a name from here and then one from Twitter if you head over to Twitter and retweet my pinned tweet. So thank you for joining me. Are there any more questions before we head out about anything but Walter's house or the story or anything in particular? If you do find that you have questions, you can always just send me a message. Next week, we'll get back to our regular rotation, and I am excited because next week's theme is going to be cemeteries. So remember to come back again next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Time to join me. So, with that being said, thank you all so much for coming. And I hope you enjoyed all the stories that I shared with you tonight. This was a lot of nostalgia for me, and it means a lot to me that you were able to join me for this. So thank you very much, and until next time. Figure out how to end this video. Oh, I'll show you the jar one more time for those who weren't here at the beginning. This is the jar from Walter's house. This is my one haunted object. So, the Newkirks have an entire museum of haunted objects. I got this one thing going on. This is my little road show here, but I've kept this since the house was torn down. So I've had this jar for like 24 years, and hopefully I'll be able to pass this on to somebody else one day, as this little unassuming jar is one of the things most valuable and dear to me. All right, so everybody have a great night, and hopefully I will see you next Tuesday.